All right, it's very good to be here among friends. There were so many sponsors. I think there's as many sponsors as there are people in the audience. So each of you must represent another organization. I've spoken for so many years on this, and I would assume that most of you are the choir. That I don't want to keep going over Occupation 101 each time. So what I'd like to do is sort of take the discussion a step further. I'll touch a little bit on the situation for those that maybe are a few people that are new. But basically, I look at you. I might be wrong, but I look at you as people that are informed about the issue, that are concerned about the issue, that know the basics of the issue, and what I'm concerned about is that we go another step and go from being informed about what's going on to really developing strategies of how do we end the occupation, how do we bring about a just peace. Thanks. And okay, good. Thanks. And also, to strategize in terms of changing policy. ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, that I head, in some ways, I think we're a little bit unique among Israeli peace organizations. And I don't know about here in the States. I mean, you can make the associations, but often I feel that a lot of the groups that we're a part of, look how many people we are. I mean, we're a very small part of the population. I don't know in any society how many people are really critical. To become critical and aware isn't easy in any society. You're not taught to be that way often by your parents. If you're lucky to be born in the right family, maybe you have a head start. The school system certainly doesn't prepare you for being critical. If you're a critical thinker, you flunk. I'm not that I'm so bright, but I was a terrible student in high school and college. So my mother says I'm speaking in all the universities I could never have gotten into. And you don't get critical analysis from the media. And churches, there are some good churches, but overall the churches are a part of the establishment and the synagogues. And in other words, if you're a person that's bright and interested, it isn't easy to really become critical. It's almost by chance. You happen to have a teacher. You happen to know somebody who I was talking today to someone who went to Israel and happened to get to know somebody that took her to Ramallah. And all of a sudden a whole new world opens, but it's serendipitous. Or maybe you hear a speaker somewhere, or you marry somebody that all of a sudden has a whole side you didn't suspect. In other words, for people to become critical in most societies, it's a serendipitous thing. It isn't something that's easy to do. And that's one reason why, I think we're so few. I think this really represents a conscious policy on the parts of states. Governments run school systems, and they run the system. I think it's actually, I wouldn't say a conspiracy, but certainly what governments want is for people to come out of the school system as good citizens and people that'll fit into the workplace. And critical people are very hard to herd. And therefore we tend to be small in numbers. And therefore I think sometimes we feel that we're marginal, that we're powerless, that we're kind of a voice in the wilderness. And so we have our little meetings in churches and so on. But we sometimes don't expect that we're really going to influence policy. That, we're not elected, we don't have power, we don't have masses behind us, we think. And I think that certainly in Israel, that's the feeling among a lot of the activist groups. There are quite a few activist groups, but they all tend to be activist. In other words, the Israeli peace movement is is comprised of, it's like a collection of activists. So we're out, I mean, we do a lot of stuff. You know, we're out planting olive trees, and then the next week we're building a house, and the next week we're bringing water down to the Bedouins, and the next week we're protesting the wall. There's a lot of stuff going on, but there's no program, there's no strategy, and I think part of it comes from the fact, actually people have told me this. They said, look, we can't influence policy. You know, why should we fool ourselves? You know, what we can do is protest. You know, we can maybe raise issues to a certain degree. We can be in solidarity with each other, but that's about it. And that I don't accept. And that's where ICAD, I think, has tried to show, we think that we can be an actor in this whole thing, in world affairs, that we can, not we individually, but we as an organization with other organizations and with civil society, we can influence policy. And what's heartening for me is, as I travel all over the world, you know, I'm meeting groups like this all over. I mean, in little towns, you know, in places you wouldn't expect. So that what's called, we used to be called the people in the 60s. We call ourselves the people. Today, there's even a fancier term. We've graduated. We're now known as the International Civil Society. You know, which has almost become a buzzword. You have civil society conferences and civil society this and that. But someone once called civil society the world's second superpower. Because in fact, we have a lot more clout than we're aware of. You know, because if you multiply this, you know, by thousands of communities and cities around the world, I mean, there's a lot of people. You saw that, you know, in the, I guess last time, most dramatically in all the demonstrations around the world against the invasion of Iraq. And then people kind of got despondent that we didn't stop the invasion of Iraq, and they went back into the woodwork. But you know, you don't always win. But at the same time, you know, we in civil society have quite a few successes under our belts. You know, one of the things I want to do, I mean, I'm just telling you, if anybody has an extra $1 million, I tell you where I'd like to go after this, or in addition to this, I would love to set up a kind of a museum of civil society. I think we're missing that, at least, if not a physical museum, at least a virtual museum on the internet. You know, they have these sites where you can go in and visit the Louvre, the museum, you know, and you go in, they have the virtual Louvre, I think, on the internet. You go into different rooms and you can see the Renaissance paintings and different periods, and then you get a description of the paintings, and you can look, I mean, you really can get a tour. And I'd like to have at least something like that, where you could have a kind of a historical tour of civil society. And have it in a way that people, everywhere you go, here in Portland, you have your local heroes. You have people that in the 30s or whatever organized strikes against, you know, for workers' rights in certain areas. You have women here that played key roles in communities, different. I mean, you know, I mean, you have a rich civil society history here in Portland, and maybe some of you know those Portland heroes, but they're not known in Seattle or in Jerusalem or wherever. And I'd like to have a kind of a site where people all over the world plug in their local heroes with pictures and with stories, and you could develop a huge museum like that. And the reason is to show us that we're not so isolated, and we're not so marginal, and we're not so little actually, and that we've had successes. You know, last year was the 200th anniversary of the legal end of the transatlantic slave trade. You know, 1807, you know, the slave trade that was extremely profitable, you know, and really involved whole industries, and you know, was declared illegal finally by the British government, that began to enforce it even among ships of other countries. that was a civil society success. That was churches organizing. I don't know if you saw, there's a film, Wilberforce, the whole hymn Amazing Grace came, I think it was called Amazing Grace, came out of that period. But, that was civil society. It was the Quakers were very involved in that. The Quakers, it's even funny, the Quakers, I used to run a Quaker college called Friends World College. The Quakers always said, it took us 200 years through a consensus process to get to an anti-slavery place. Once we did, we really started to work seriously. But, it was the Quakers, it was churches, it was other progressive elements, and it happened. And if we think back in terms of anti-war struggles, the suffragette movement, women's issues, if we think about the anti-colonial struggles, anti-war struggles, today you have environmental. We're all over the place, which is good. We could be more organized. And we're dealing with all kinds of issues as critical people. And really, if you look at the history of the world, it would be a pretty miserable place today if it hadn't been for us. In all kinds. So I think a museum like that or a site like that would kind of let us know that there's a context, that we're not alone, we're not so isolated, and give us a little bit more, maybe a little bit more encouragement to work. But that's in a sense where I'm coming from. I think that we can influence policy. We work with, in ICAD we work with diplomats, and actually, it's not just civil society, but governments. I've discovered that governments are interested in what we have to say. Not always the Prime Minister and the President and those guys that are all politically motivated, but the professional people and many people in parliaments, less so in Congress, but there's a few. There are people that are with us that we can work with that like our voice, that are really like our analysis. I want to tell you that the American consulate in Jerusalem, not in East Jerusalem, the American consulate is actually in West Jerusalem. The American consulate is excellent in terms of our work. They really support us. The American, the system is from before 1967, there was an American embassy in Tel Aviv, and there's an American consulate in part of it was in East Jerusalem. Now it's sort of mixed. There's one part there and one part in West Jerusalem. But you had that split system that actually a lot of countries have. And the American embassy is the usual. It's in Tel Aviv, and it's in the middle of Israel, and the ambassador is a political appointee, and not much comes out of that. That's critical. But the consulate, the people working in the American consulate are professional diplomats. They're not political appointees. The consul general is usually someone who's been in the State Department for years, who has served in other Arab countries, who speaks Arabic. The people, the staff, the Americans working in the consulate live in East Jerusalem. They live with Palestinians. Their job is to monitor what's happening in the Palestinian territories. And what's very interesting is they're not under the embassy. The consulate, which is unusual, but it's true for other countries in Israel, Palestine, is that the consulate has its own status. It reports directly to the Secretary of State. And what's useful is that it has this unmediated channel. So it can't be filtered through all the politicos of the embassy. And it has, so there really is, you don't see it in policy, but in fact, in the State Department, there really is a channel between the Palestinians and the American diplomats that know what's happening with the Palestinians and the State Department. If you go, Condoleezza Rice, there's all kinds of reasons why American policy is the way it is. But it's not because of a lack of information. If I go in to meet, I don't meet Condoleezza Rice, but I can get into, Bill Burns, which is sort of the second that, the bloc in American policy is Elliott Abrams, the neocon from the old Iran Gate days and the Contra days, who's the head of the Middle East section of the National Security Council. So that ends that. But below him, when you get to the professional levels, they know what's going on. If I go to the State Department, there's very little I can tell them that they don't know. On the contrary, I'm kind of getting into other things, but I'll come back. I used to have a secretary when I was in Friends World College who was Irish. And every morning she'd sit down and start telling me stories. And I say, oh God, I got to get to work. I have to do, and she'd go off to a million. But the story always would come back around to the point. So the point is coming around in a minute. But at any rate, the point I'm trying to make is that we do have input. I mean, we can't say the governments are evil, and we can't eliminate. We have allies even in the worst kinds of places, and we have to understand in the American government that the people know what's going on, the professionals. It's when you get to the political level that that all these extraneous considerations come in. I would estimate, just to, in this sense, I would estimate that 80% of the policy that has to do with Israel-Palestine has nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict itself, with the merits of the case. It has to do with getting elected and partisan politics and lobbyists and the military. One of the strong, we talk about AIPAC, but one of the strongest advocates for Israel is the Pentagon and the military. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And that's what really determines policy. But in fact, they know in the State Department what's going on. It isn't a lack of information. It isn't that they have it at their disposal if they want it. So that as we work with governments, we work with civil society groups, we work with church groups, we work with all kinds of groups all over the world. And I think that we're making a difference. I mean, I couldn't stand up 10 years ago and talk about Palestinians. 10 years ago, you didn't use the word Palestinian in the public. I mean, half of you would have gotten up to yell at me. You didn't talk about occupation 10 years ago or so. In other words, we've advanced the discourse. I think people get it more. They're not all active, but I think they're there, and I think we're beginning to affect policy in all kinds of ways. Maybe not immediately, but there's a whole. I'm encouraged by the process, actually, so that what I'm trying to say is that I think that maybe the lack of strategy we have, the fact that we're not so organized. I was asking Peter and Lee on the way here. Is there, it's nice to speak, is there a peace and justice center in Portland where all the groups meet? There isn't, apparently. Or maybe there is and people don't know, it's a secret. But we're not organized enough. We're just not organized enough. And the reason, why, with all the different groups in Portland, and look at the list of people look at the groups that sponsor me. Why isn't there a center where everybody has an office and everybody's meeting and there's synergy and all that stuff? I think part of it is because sometimes we don't believe that we can change things. And so we do what we do and then we go home and live our lives. And that's where, I think we're trying to make a difference. We're analyzing, we're protesting, we're rebuilding houses and all that stuff, going to Gaza, but at the same time, we're trying to think strategically and mobilize people, believing that we can, in the ways that civil society does, make a difference. And civil society, we're limited. We're not elected. Governments don't work with civil society. And we have to push and be assertive, but I think we can do that. And that's especially true when we begin to get into the issue of warehousing that I want to talk about. So let me just back up for a minute and talk a little bit about the conflict itself, and then I want to get into this warehousing issue. But I'm trying to do this in a way that gets us thinking together about how can we organize, what are the issues better. And certainly the issue of warehousing, I think, is something that begins to put together issues that are today kind of fragmented. One of our problems, I think, and you can see it here, you're probably the people in Portland that are interested in the Israel-Palestine issue. Where's everybody else that's interested in anti-war stuff, in Iraq, in global warming, in women's issues, in health issues, in development stuff, where are they all? We're so fragmented. I mean, it's good that we have a division of labor because, you can't deal with everything. But at the same time, we don't see the connections between this issue and that issue and the other issues. This issue of warehousing, I'm going to suggest, might be one of those issues that begins to bring the Israel-Palestine conflict into a whole field with other concerns, and might help us to build wider coalitions and wider forums for discussion. Well, this is just to go back for those that maybe aren't Palestine wonks. Just to fill in some of the background, and then we're gonna go on from there. This is a map of what we call the two-state solution. The two-state solution is a solution that seems to be preferred by the international community. Even the United States has the two-state solution through the roadmap as its preferred solution. The two-state solution has even been accepted by the Palestinians. Already in 1988, 20 years ago, the Palestinians, the PLO, accepted the two-state solution. So if Israel is really concerned about peace and security, they could have had that 20 years ago. So something else is going on here. The two-state solution is not a just solution, really, because even though the Palestinians get a state, it's only a state on the occupied territories, which is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, that represent only about 22% of a small country. Even though the Palestinians today are half the population of this country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, before refugees come back. And so they would be the majority. So in fact, the generous offer that we never hear about, the Palestinian generous offer, is that we, the majority of, and the indigenous population of Palestine, are willing to make peace with Israel for less than a quarter of the land. I mean, Israel is left on 78% of the land of Palestine. I mean, I don't know any people in the world, certainly any colonized people, that was willing to, in a way, give up political claim to 78% of its country. I don't think Americans would have done that. So that, and Native Americans wouldn't have done that if they had a choice. I mean, it's really extraordinary, and yet that's the situation, the two-state solution idea. But Israel has said no. I mean, it's not only the Palestinians, but in 2002, the Arab League, in what's called the Saudi Initiative, said to Israel, if you give up the occupied territories, we will not only recognize you and make peace with you, we will integrate you, Israel, into the Middle East. And Israel said no. So it's hard to explain that. What's going on here? If it's not peace and security that Israel always claims it is, that's really what it wants, and it's defending itself against terrorism, and it's the victim, and all this stuff. Our country is in danger. Why wouldn't they have grabbed this offer? At least to try it out. I mean, Israel is infinitely superior militarily to the Palestinians. They could have tried it, and if in fact it was a trap and a trick, okay, so now we know, but it certainly wouldn't have threatened Israel's existence. They could have gone back and reconquered the West Bank and Gaza in a minute. Why didn't they try? Why was that just dismissed, that historic opportunity for peace and security that is still on the table, but which I think is gone? Why wasn't that taken up? And so that there's a whole element of the occupation, of the conflict, of Israel's policy that you can't understand rationally. Peace and security doesn't explain it. Something else is going on. And this is the something else. There's an issue here of exclusivity, and the problem with this is that if you don't understand this, you don't get it. You can't explain Israeli policy and what Israel's doing and why it's building settlements and why it says, like Olmert said, I want a two-state solution of peace, and then the next day he says we're building 1,000 new housing units in the West Bank. You know, it doesn't make sense unless you understand this principle. But the problem is, if you're not Jewish, you can't say this, because you'll be accused of being anti-Semitic. So, you know, we're in a conflict that's a major conflict, in which the very source of the conflict is unspeakable. We can't say it. And so that's what ends up distorting the discussion so much. You can't talk about the source of the conflict. And the source of the conflict is the Israeli concept of what it is, of what Israel is. Jewish nationalism, Zionism, that comes out of Eastern Europe. I'm not going to get into a whole thing about this tonight, but you know, Israel claims to be the only democracy in the Middle East, and it looks like a democracy. I mean, it's pretty white, and it's middle class. You know, the Israeli standard of living is on a European level, and we do have elections, and our leaders speak English really well, so they're on TV all the time. It looks fairly familiar. We have McDonald's and we have Burger Kings and all that stuff. But in fact, Israel is not a democracy. In concept, it's not a democracy, because a democracy is when a country belongs to its citizens. You have a concept of citizens, and a country belongs to its citizens. Now, we know there's racism, there's discrimination. I mean, I'm not presenting an ideal picture of democracy, obviously. But nevertheless, that's the conception. And so you're able to fight racism, you're able to fight discrimination, you're able to fight oppression, because at least you're going with the flow. The flow, I mean, the Supreme Court, for everything else, is supposed to be defending the rights of citizens, because the country belongs to its citizens. You're supposed to have elections and all that stuff. I mean, at least the conception is you can work with. In Eastern Europe, until today, Russia, Poland, Serbia, Romania, and so on, you don't have that. You don't have that concept of democracy. Those countries are what we can call ethnocracies. An ethnocracy is when a country belongs to a particular religious or ethnic group or national group. South Africa, in the days of apartheid, was an ethnocracy. South Africa belonged to the white Europeans. Right? And that's the way the system was, and that was the flag, and that was the conception, and that was the political system. So when South Africa moved to black majority rule, it wasn't some technical change. Okay, now the black Africans have the vote. Good. No. The whole country had to be reconceptualized, had to be reinvented. South Africa had a new constitution. You see? So it had to make a transition. It wasn't from just these people voting to everybody voting. No. It was a whole reconception of South Africa from an ethnocracy to a democracy. And that's, of course, what Mandela fought for. And when Mandela was in prison, de Klerk came with all kinds of suggestions. Let's have a three-house parliament with whites, coloreds, and blacks. You know, let's have power sharing. Let's have this. Let's have that. And Mandela rejected everything because he says an ethnocracy, which he didn't use that term, apartheid, an apartheid system, that in principle, in structure, in concept, privileges one group over others, can't be reformed. You can't tinker with it. The system is unjust and can't work. And that's, I think, the situation here in Israel. The concept of Israel is an ethnocracy that comes out of Eastern Europe. Because, you know, when Zionism was developing as a national ideology 100 years ago, most of the Jews, 90% of the Jews in the late 19th century lived in Russia. So they're not going to jump to some Jeffersonian democracy. They took the kind of nationalism that they knew. And therefore, this sentence really summarizes, it's not just an ideology, it's the way it's the way Israel is conceived by the Jewish population. It's the way the whole country is structured. And that is that the land of Israel, because in an ethnocracy, it's a tribal, unlike the United States, which is more of a civil democracy, where your national identity is your citizenship. Here, your national identity is whether you're Jewish or not, you see. So that the whole thrust of Zionism is to reclaim the historical land of Israel, at least to the Jordan River. And that's the national thing. It isn't to set up it isn't just to have a country for Jews. No, the whole idea is to reclaim or redeem, to use the biblical language, the entire land of Israel. Well, if we want to do that, and that's the process we're in, and it's a moral, good, justified process in Zionist terms, then we don't want borders. Because borders, like a normal state has, that defines a state, constrain you. I mean, if these are the borders of the country, then how do we get the rest of it? You see? We have to leave it open-ended so we can continue to expand to the point where we have the whole land of Israel. Because the important thing in a tribal society is that the tribe has its turf. Its turf is holy. Its turf belongs exclusively to it. And you have to take the words from the Serbian experience, you have to ethnically cleanse. You have to purify your territory. And look at the words we use. Motherland, fatherland, homeland. We use very primordial terms to describe our sacred territory. So if you have a state like Russia or like Israel that's based on a tribe purifying and taking possession of its turf, then you don't have the normal state system and you don't have boundaries, but you talk about the land of Israel. Even as you know, the most liberal newspaper in Israel is called Haaretz, which means the land. That's the way we talk. If I meet you in Israel in everyday language, I'll ask you, where are you from in the land? You don't use the word state or the state of Israel or in everyday language. You talk about the land. So the land of Israel, which is an undivided integral entity, belongs exclusively. I mean, if this is tribal, a tribe is exclusive. You don't join a tribe. You can't become a part of. The tribe is a blood kind of almost primordial thing that has a turf, that kind of a tie. So there's an exclusivity here. You can't share it. So it can't be pluralistic. So the land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. That's the concept. So if you're Jewish living in Portland, you have a right to live anywhere, to automatic citizenship, and to live anywhere you want in the land of Israel. All right? If you're a Palestinian who's a citizen of Israel, who lives here, whose family has been in the country for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, you're excluded from 93% of the land of the country. 93% of Israel is land that's owned collectively by the state in the name of the Jewish people. So that in a Western democracy like the United States would be considered racist. When one group formally and legally it gives itself privileges that other groups don't have, that's racism, right? But in Israel, it's not considered racism. The concept we have of Judaization, that we're Judaizing the country, I mean, it's like waspification. And you have racists in the United States. I mean, they're located largely in Montana, but you've got them in different places. Talk about the white Aryan American people and how you have to Christianize. I mean, but if someone would get up here and say Portland should be 72% WASPs, and everybody else is, by law, limited, there's a quota on where you could live and who can live here, and then we're going to demolish the houses of those that aren't. I mean, that would obviously be considered racist. Well, that's the policy in Israel. Israel has an explicit formal policy that Jerusalem should be 72% Jewish. That's the whole thrust of urban policy. That's why houses are demolished in East Jerusalem of Palestinians. Palestinians can't, even on their own land, they can't build houses because we're trying to keep a 72%, 28% majority of Jews over Arabs, and we don't see it as racist. That's the problem we have in the left. We try to come in, we try to talk about this stuff, but it's not considered racist because they say, what's the problem? Of course we're redeeming Jerusalem, our ancient capital. Of course we're redeeming our land because it's ours. So it's a very fundamentally different concept than you have in the West. And you've got to, and therefore the flip side of it is that Arabs, and I say Arabs purposely because in Israel we don't use the word Palestinians. You talk about Arabs because if I say this is my land and it belongs to me exclusively, and there's no other people here that have legitimate claims and rights to my land, well, then I'm not going to talk about Palestinians, because to say the word Palestinian is recognizing that there is another collective, there is another people here that I want to deny. So we talk about Arabs in a very undifferentiated way. So Arabs reside in our country by sufferance and not by right. As long as they shut up and they know their place, they can stay there. But they should not think that they have a right to challenge our ownership of this country. And there's zero tolerance when they do, as you can see from the extremely disproportionate reactions of Israel every time there's Palestinian resistance. So this is sort of what underlies the conflict. And it means that in order to really get to a just peace, it isn't only that we have to assert the rights of the Palestinians. And we've succeeded in that. I mean, I don't think today you have to convince even Bush that there is a Palestinian people. I mean, but that's a huge thing. I mean, that's something that Israel has fought tooth and nail, for the last 60 years. Because this is the fact that the international community recognizes there is a Palestinian people, which Israel has never done, really fundamentally undermines the Zionist enterprise and can lead to peace. The problem is that Israel is not going to be a partner, a willing partner, because Israel will not give up this. Israel will not become a country of all its citizens. It won't go voluntarily through the process of reconceptualizing itself like South Africa did. That has to be imposed. So in a sense, we might say that the democracies of the world or the international community has to impose a peace on Israel in which Israel can continue to think of itself any way it wants to, but it can't actualize that concept. It can't actualize that concept over the whole country and commit the Palestinians to it. But where it's led us then is to different things. First of all, we use the word occupation. So in 1967, Israel took over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, right? And we talk about occupation. In fact, I would suggest to you that there's a process here in which the actual occupation maybe lasted 2 weeks. The first couple of weeks of June, when after the 6-Day War, because occupation is defined in international law as as having effective control of a territory. And Israel basically accepted that definition for 2 weeks. After those 2 weeks, it began to say, no, wait a minute, it isn't the West Bank, this is Judea and Samaria. This is a part of our homeland. And you began to have the process of seeing the whole land of Israel as an integral part. So that you had different things happening. You had the institutionalization of military orders. There are about 2,000 military orders that comprise a whole body of law that runs the West Bank. The most important thing is Meir Shamgar, who was the Attorney General in Israel at that time, who was later the President of the Supreme Court, redefined occupation. So in his view, Israel has no occupation because this is our country. And you can't occupy your own country. And therefore, the territories were defined as administered or disputed territories. And that's been something that was accepted by the Israeli Supreme Court until today. And then there were plans of annexation, especially by Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan, just a couple weeks after the Six-Day War. So you might say that here, we talk about occupation, but the very concept of occupation, meaning that we, Israel, are controlling a foreign territory, was almost immediately discarded. And the territory was redefined as our territory. So there is no occupied territory for Israel. We don't use the word occupation in Israel. It's not an acceptable term. So you can imagine having a political discussion with Israelis where there's no Palestinians, there's no occupation, right? And what do you end up talking about? Well, it's all reduced to terrorism, because then it's all decontextualized, depoliticized, and the only thing and it's like a mugging. The Palestinians are attacking us in our own country. They're not even Palestinians. The Arabs are attacking us in our own country, and that's the way Israelis see it. Occupation. Now we go from occupation to a process in which Israel begins to incorporate the West Bank into Israel. The West Bank and Gaza, although Gaza is Israel doesn't really want Gaza. There's too many people there, it's such a mess. And Gaza, and this biblical stuff is arcane, but it has its role. Gaza is not considered the land of Israel in religious thought. The land of Israel sort of had other borders, and Gaza was Philistine. And that's where the word Palestinians comes from. So Gaza and Sinai and the whole Negev below Beersheba wasn't the land of Israel. If you know the story of Ishmael, Abraham's son, his first son, who became, who was expelled by Sarah when Isaac was born and became the father of the Arab peoples. He was thrown out and away by Abraham, although Abraham was very reluctant, and was exiled to Beersheba. That's where he went. He didn't go to Saudi Arabia, Ishmael. Because Beersheba was considered the desert. It was outside of the Fertile Crescent. It was outside of the civilized area. So Beersheba was not the land of Israel. Now this sounds really interesting, but but it really plays a role in Israeli policy. Otherwise you can't explain why Menachem Begin, who was the champion of the greater land of Israel, would give up Sinai. Or why Israel would Gaza has a very different status than the West Bank. So they're all occupied territories, but Israel is trying very hard today to isolate Gaza, and it wants Egypt to take over Gaza again. That's one of the points of the sanctions, is to get Egypt to take over the electrical system. Egypt should begin to let the people, the Palestinians, in through Egypt, through the Rafah. In other words, to disconnect Gaza from the West Bank, which makes our annexation much easier. At any rate, what Israel then did in the West Bank and East Jerusalem was to put a matrix of control. And many of you have heard me talk about this, so I'm not going to get into it. A matrix of control. In other words, it sort of left the idea of occupation out. It didn't, and Israel was trying very much to present a case in which this is Judea and Samaria, it's a part of our country, and therefore to extend its legal system and to routinize its rule over the West Bank. And it was a de facto annexation. You couldn't annex it actually, because if you annexed it actually, then you get the Palestinians together with their land. And you didn't want that. You wanted the land, which is ours, but you didn't want, what are you going to do with 4 million Palestinians? If we actually annexed it, Israel wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. It would be the greater land of Israel, but half the population is Palestinian, which wouldn't work. So the game, the dance over these years until today has been, how do we take the land and control the land of Israel to the Jordan River, but somehow get rid of the Palestinians? So that one way is that we have a policy that's called the quiet transfer. And that is that through administrative means, revoking residency, if Palestinians come here to study, they can't go home, and house demolitions, making things, destroying the economy so there's no jobs. What Israel is aiming for is to get the middle classes out. It's a selective kind of a transfer. We're not going to get the working class people, the farmers, the poor people out of the country. They're stuck. They have nowhere to go. And we have to find a way to deal with them. But the middle classes that provide the leadership, that are more educated, that are more economically active, those are the people we have to get rid of. Because if we can get rid of them, then the masses are much more malleable and easy to control. And that's really been the focus of the policy, and creating facts on the ground. So in fact, especially when Begin came into power in 1977, this policy of de facto annexation really was crystallized. And Sharon became the head of the Ministerial Committee on Settlements. And then you began to have the development of settlements, of the highway grid that integrated and incorporated the West Bank into Israel proper. East Jerusalem, of course, was formally annexed to Israel. So when Israel talks about giving up parts of the West Bank, it doesn't include East Jerusalem. And of course, there's no solution. Everything is kept kind of open-ended because the solution is going to be on the ground. There's no solution that's acceptable to Israel. So that we talk about, in a vague way, Palestinian autonomy. But otherwise, it's very vague. Now, the second phase of the matrix has been within the last, let's say, 8 or 9 years. Especially since Ehud Barak came to power at the end of the Oslo, he ended the Oslo peace process in 1999. And Barak's contribution, in quotes, was that he really did conceptualize the solution to the conflict as apartheid. As apartheid. In other words, he and until today, I mean, he's a minister of defense, he's still the head of the Labour Party, which is the left party, supposedly. But he's the one that really is thinking in terms of a solution to the conflict. But it's a solution that has to be an apartheid solution, although we can't use the word apartheid, obviously. So we talk about a two-state solution. In other words, we use the language that the international community has approved of, the two-state solution, and we give our very particular spin to it. So that what Barak began to do was to continue during the Oslo peace process to strengthen the facts on the ground, settlements, highways, the closure, and so on. And at the same time, in terms of a solution, you see, he put that within the two-state solution. So that especially he came up with the idea of settlement blocks. And keep going for a minute, and then we're going to go back. It's a little, here. You see, these areas here that are kind of, I don't know what they look like, pinkish or whatever, on the map, these are what Israel calls the settlement blocks. This was Barak's formulation. Barak said, okay, we need a two-state solution because we've got to get rid of this Palestinian population. You know, what are we going to do with these 4 billion people? We can't throw them out. We can't give them citizenship. And we won't give them a state on the 22% because that's too much. This is our country. This is Judea and Samaria. We have to find a way to give them the minimum. So we keep control of the country. We keep control of the land, most of the land. And it's the same logic as South Africa. How do we get rid of that population but still keep control? South Africa created 10 Bantustans. 10 Bantustans on 11% of South African land. Israel's creating a Palestinian Bantustan on 15% of the country. where Israel will then expand from 78% out to 85%. And the settlement blocks are the key. And that, because you see, if we keep these settlement blocks, even if we give up little settlements all the way through these Palestinian areas, we've created what Sharon calls cantons. So there's a canton you can see created in the north. Palestinians don't get anywhere near the border. So any Palestinian state will not have a border with an Arab country, because that's where our security comes in. So you have a canton in the north, a canton in the center, and a canton in the south, and Gaza. And that becomes then the contours of the Palestinian Bantustan. But we don't say Bantustan, we say a Palestinian state, and it's a two-state solution. And then the trick is, like in South Africa could not have created Ciskei and Transkei and all these crazy little places without finding local collaborators. Some guy who said, yes, I'll be the president of Transkei. It's the same is true here. We're trying to find a Palestinian collaborator that will sign off on this. And this is Tony Blair's role. Tony Blair's role as a so-called Middle East envoy is to come and try to sweeten the deal for the Palestinians. You know, we tried with Arafat and it didn't work. He wouldn't be the collaborator. And I believe, and maybe I shouldn't say this, I believe Arafat was eliminated. I don't think his death was just a coincidence. It was too perfect, and until today it's never been explained. And then we went, and now we're trying Abu Mazen. And Abu Mazen is getting close, but I don't believe Abu Mazen is going to be a collaborator either. And at some point we're going to have to go beyond him. We'll see how it plays out. But the idea of Tony Blair is to say to Abu Mazen, all right, what do you need to sign off on this deal? You want a little more territory? All right, we can persuade Israel, give you a little more here, maybe a bit more in here. Maybe, you'll have a road to the Dead Sea if you want to go to a beach. You want a little army? We'll give you a little army. Russia is now sending armored personnel carriers to the Palestinian Authority. The United States has this General Dayton, who's the military guy who's trying to build the Palestinian Authority into Israel's police force. And there's a very real danger that the Fatah will invade Gaza and to try to eliminate Hamas. I mean, under the guise of, under Israeli supervision. So we'll give you a little army. You'll be a VIP, of course. You'll be the president. We'll give you a few $1 billion so you can build some neighborhoods. You can at least go through the motions of developing your country. You know what? We'll give you 50,000 work permits so some of your people can go work in Israel. In other words, what do you need to sweeten the deal? These little minor things, and the idea is that then he'll sign. I don't think it'll happen. I don't think even Abu Mazen can do that. So that what's missing today, and this is the problem, is that collaborator. But the concept of apartheid is very clear and very worked out, and this is what the Annapolis process is all about. Okay, go back. Okay. All right, go back one more. So that this is, in a way, this is the apartheid conception. This is the Bantustan. And you get to this by simply taking out what are called the settlement blocks. You add the line of the wall that's being built, because the wall that's called a security barrier. It's not called the wall is a separation barrier. It's not called the security barrier. It's not really for security, it's for separation. Israel calls its policy towards the Palestinians hafradah, which in Hebrew means separation. That's the word, that's the official word of our policy, which is apartheid. That's what apartheid means in Afrikaans. So we use the word apartheid officially, we just say it in Hebrew instead of in Afrikaans. And the name, the official name of the wall is the separation barrier. And it's conceived as a demographic border. So Israel will have in this conception two eastern borders. So you say, wait a minute, there's only one east. How do you get two eastern borders? Well, you see, the border here immediately to the east of Israel is the demographic border. defined by the wall, in which 80% of the settlers that live in these settlement blocks and in Greater Jerusalem are then incorporated into Israel. But the Jordan River is Israel's security border that Israel will never give up. So in a sense, you get the Palestinians squeezed between two eastern Israeli borders in these kinds of cantons. This is the conception, and this is why we talk about apartheid. In other words, we're going from occupation to this matrix of control and autonomy, a very vague thing, to a much more definite conception of apartheid that Israel is actually trying to enforce today. And that's the Annapolis process. Okay, but the Palestinians have one source of clout, one source of leverage, and that is, and this is what Gandhi always said, they can say no. And that's what they've been doing. In other words, if an oppressed people says no, they gum up the works. It gums up the works. I mean, you've got to at least have a pretense of some president of Palestine who signs off on it, that Israel can at least go around and say, look, the Palestinians agree, even if it's a fakey thing. But if you don't have that, you can't really impose apartheid. You know, that's where I think that's where civil society has really succeeded. 10 years ago, I would say Israel is winning. You couldn't talk about Palestinians, you couldn't talk about occupation. Israel was... Now, today, I think we've achieved a tie, a draw. And that is that, look, it's true, the Palestinians cannot overthrow the occupation. They can't get a viable state today on their own. That's still distant from them. But at the same time, look at this Annapolis process. Here is Israel with absolute control of the occupied territories, 250 settlements, the absolutely uncritical support of the United States, the complicity of Europe, massive military power, and yet it can't nail it down. The Annapolis process next month will be a year old, and nothing's come out of it, because you can't impose on an oppressed people apartheid. You can oppress them. You can keep, imposing these things, but you can't get them to agree. And that's the Palestinian clout. And here's where I want to make a transition and open the discussion a little bit wider for a couple minutes. And that is that part of the Palestinian clout is the fact that this conflict is not a localized conflict only. It's not simply a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But this has become a global conflict. The Palestinians, I don't know if they've succeeded. I wouldn't put it that way. I don't think, but the Palestinian issue for the Muslim world has become emblematic. This is the epitome. This is the expression of the world. I think even more than Iraq, which is a later conflict. This is the epitome of the clash of civilizations from the Muslim point of view. American imperialism, Western neocolonialism, the humiliation of Islam, a hot war in which Muslim and Arab lands are taken away, the oppression. I mean, this really is neocolonialism. And so for them, this is like the what's it called? Not the linchpin, the bellwether or something. There's a word I'm missing. Of the whole global, in other words, this is how they conceive, through the lens of Palestine, the whole way the world is structured. And this is, you see in bin Laden's tapes. I mean, in a lot of bin Laden's tapes, he mentions Palestine, sometimes very specifically. He mentions Ramallah. He mentions Jenin, I mean, in a very specific way. And journalists tell me that wherever you go in the Muslim world, from Nigeria to Indonesia, with all the problems all those countries have in between, you get into a political discussion and in 2 minutes, the Palestine issue emerges. It's right there in your face. So in a sense, the Palestinians have this clout because if they say, as long as they say this conflict is not over, we have not achieved a political accommodation with Israel that we can live with, the conflict is not over. There's nothing Israel and the United States can do to close this thing down, or to nail it down, or to get to any kind of a solution, so-called, unless the Palestinians agree. You can even get the Arab governments to agree. You know, and you've got peace with Egypt, you've got peace with Jordan, you've got Syria suing for peace and so on, but not the peoples. And those regimes are very unstable and are going to fall eventually. So that the Palestinians have that support of the Muslim world, and I think beyond. I think they have growing support in this country and in Europe, certainly. They have growing support, and in the rest of the world as well. So that's all right. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that Israel says, okay, if we can't nail this down, if we can't achieve this apartheid solution, then we won't have any solution. We'll go back to what we've been doing the last 41 years, which is an open-ended situation. There's no solution, there's no process, and this gets us into the issue of warehousing. And this is where the global elements really begin to emerge. Because Israel can say, all right, you know, we don't have to reach a solution. We can have a de facto a situation. We can keep the status quo going forever. Now, the question we always ask is, how does Israel get away with this? Here you've got this terrible conflict, you know, in the Holy Land, no less, on the southern border of Europe, in the light of day, massive violations of human rights, defiance of dozens of UN resolutions, violations of international law. Not only how does it get away with it, but how does it get the support of the American government? Right. You know, I mean, how does that happen? Well, you know, you can talk about AIPAC, you can talk about the Christian fundamentalists and this and that, but Kissinger once said that countries don't have friends. They have interests. And I don't believe the United States is going to sell its interests because of guilt over the Holocaust or because of AIPAC. You know, AIPAC's powerful, but it doesn't run the United States. Cheney, with all due respect, is not a great fan of Jews. And I don't think AIPAC runs Cheney. And neither do the Christian fundamentalists. I mean, they have their clout, certainly. But the United States is not going to give itself over to Jews and Christian fundamentalists. There's something else going on here. There's something else. There's some other interest that this is serving, this conflict, that has to explain why the United States is so committed to this. And not only that, why the United States is willing and even to be isolated in the world. You know, if you look at every UN vote that has to do with Palestine, it's the entire world, including all of Europe, including Tony Blair even. The entire world against Israel and the United States in the UN. I mean, the United States is paying really a price for this. Alienated itself from the entire Muslim world. James Baker called this the epicenter of instability in the entire Muslim world. I mean, the United States is really paying, and so the question is why? What's going on? And here I want to take just a page from Naomi Klein, because I think Naomi Klein has put her finger on it, especially in her latest book, The Shock Doctrine, that you all are assigned to read. You have to read The Shock Doctrine, which is really a brilliant and amazing book. And she talks about warehousing. She didn't invent the term, but she uses it. The term warehousing, what I'm trying to get at is that the reason why Israel has this support from the United States and from Europe to a certain degree is that, you know, in the way Naomi Klein shows us, in the free market capitalist system, what we call predatory capitalism. I mean, it's an aggressive capitalist system that she ascribes largely to the influence of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, the Chicago Boys, as they were called, who are also Obama's advisors, because we have to remember Obama happens to be from Chicago. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. In this extreme free market capitalist philosophy and ideology, and and they have the power to enforce it, half the peoples of the world, half the population of the world, if not more, is surplus humanity. I mean, how's that for a theological concept? Surplus humanity. In other words, these are people that are simply written off. The system, the capitalist system, does not need them. They'll never be productive. They'll never be really educated. The system doesn't need them at all. And therefore they're written off. And the concept of warehousing began with prisoners. That was where the term became most used. There are millions and millions of prisoners in the world, all over the world, who are warehoused. I mean, the United States has one of the largest prisoner populations in the world. Who thinks about them? They're gone. They're disappeared. We don't talk about them. We don't think about them. They're not an issue. They're not going to come up in the Obama-McCain debates. Who cares about prisoners? There is a few groups, especially in our circles, who are concerned with prison reform, who bring that up, but it's never become a major issue because, and there's even the idea, I suppose, among most people, well, they're in jail, they probably should be in jail. So the few exceptions is too bad, but in other words, it's been made a non-issue. And that's the power. Once you can make a people an issue a non-issue, it disappears. I go back to my days of dating, when I used to go out, and you'd go out and with a young woman in those days, and you'd have you're courting, you're having a relationship, and oh great. So if she would say, "I love you," it would be wonderful. If she says, "I hate you," okay, I can work with that. But when you heard her say, "Let's be friends," it was over. That is nothing. There's nowhere to go from there. You just go home. There's nowhere to go. In other words, you've become a non-issue. There's nothing to work on. Okay. And in a sense, I think there's an equivalency here. Once you make an issue a non-issue, it's gone. It doesn't arouse emotions. You don't talk about it. There's nowhere to go with it. So you can be really committed to prison reform, but those of you that are active in that really know what a stonewall you face, because if it's not an issue, then no politician feels obliged to deal with it. There's no money for it, and all that stuff. And then the concept of warehousing was extended to include people's living permanently in slums. There's a book by Mike Davis called Planet of Slums, in which he says there are 1 billion people permanently warehoused in the 29 largest urban slums in the world. Right? In other words, they're there and they're going to stay there forever. The system doesn't need them, they're just there. And then you go on, and it's been applied to immigrants, undocumented immigrants, so-called illegal immigrants, where there are millions all over the world. And then it's been applied to whole continents. Africa. Africa, you might say, is a continent that's being warehoused. And all the attention to Africa is humanitarian. You have Bono going out and having all kinds of concerts, and you're raising food to send to Ethiopia, and you've got the Darfur stuff and all that. But it's all humanitarian, because I think once you move to a humanitarian approach, you've given up the political. You've given up any attempt to change things or to bring people into the system. You're basically saying these people are simply basket cases, and all we can do is feed them and be sure they don't suffer too much. And that's the problem with Gaza. That's why I went on the Gaza trip, because the Gaza trip was framed politically. The idea was to break the siege. It was not to bring medicine to these poor Palestinians, to bring food, to bring, no, I mean, we did bring some hearing aids because we didn't want to go with our hands empty, but it was not a humanitarian mission. And the whole attempt to characterize Gaza as a humanitarian crisis. And then you've got this massive industry of relief organizations, the Red Cross and Oxfam and CARE and World Vision and the UN agencies. I mean, there's a million organizations bringing foods and medicines and everything into Gaza. That feeds the problem, because then basically you've deflected the attention from the political. You've defined it in a suffering, as if the people of Gaza are suffering from a hurricane or from an earthquake. You depoliticize the whole thing. And that's the way it can be forever. And that's where, once it becomes humanitarian, I think it's become a non-issue. Or it's become a kind of a charity issue. And that's the worst situation to be in. And then warehousing. And so Naomi Klein talks about this whole process of warehousing that's going on. And she suggests, she has a whole chapter on Israel-Palestine, in which she suggests, to go back to our question, the reason Israel gets the support it gets from the United States and the whole capitalist system is because the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories, are a laboratory. Israel is developing a model of warehousing that's very useful to the industrialized world. Here you got 4 million people that they're guinea pigs. You're building a model of warehousing. And one of the points Naomi Klein makes is that people aren't warehoused voluntarily. Nobody gets warehoused voluntarily. You resist. And of course that resistance is then, because part of the co-optation that I'll talk about in a second is the framing. Part of it is terrorism. If you resist warehousing, you're a terrorist, right? And you're especially a terrorist because it's depoliticized, it's decontextualized. So here Israel says, and Shimon Peres, who's the president, has said this, that when Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, the language, he wasn't captured by Hamas, he was kidnapped. You see? So the language is a criminal language, as if this guy was walking down the street and kidnapped. The fact that he's a soldier doesn't play any role in the discourse in Israel. You see? So he was kidnapped, and what Shimon Peres says is, why did they kidnap this kid? I mean, there is no more occupation in Gaza. We took out the settlers, we took out the army, Gaza is free, there's no occupation, which is what Israel's trying to claim. So you see, the fact that they attacked this kid for no reason, it's like a mugging, shows that they're basically terrorists. So the whole thing works together to create this decontextualized thing in which then the people that resist warehousing are terrorists, and then if they're terrorists, of course, you're justified and legitimized in attacking them and destroying the resistance, because terrorism is not seen as resistance, it's seen as bad guys. And here, insurgents. You see how they've captured the language? If you go out in the street and you say the word insurgents, 90% of the people are going to say the insurgents are the bad guys, right? The insurgents in Iraq, the insurgents are the bad guys. Well, the insurgents, if we think about it for a minute, are the people. Yeah, I mean, I think Paul Revere was probably an insurgent. You know, if you go to Mexico City, one of the major boulevards in Mexico City is called the Avenue of the Insurgents. Zapata and Pancho Villa are the good guys for the Mexicans, not General Pershing. You know, all over the world, and this is part of that civil society thing where we have to recapture our language. The people resisting are the good guys, and it's the states and the corporations and the others that are the bad guys. But our whole language has been corrupted, and that all serves this warehousing complex, or what Naomi Klein calls the disaster capitalism complex. It's a system. It's a system. So that if Israel not only can construct a system of control the matrix of control that I mentioned. And then it develops mechanisms of control, particularly military and counterinsurgency. Israel is one of the world's leaders in counterinsurgency, which means fighting the people. And where do you learn counterinsurgency the best, if not on the West Bank and Gaza? Here you've got 4 million insurgents. So if you can develop a model for controlling them, for controlling the restless people in the warehouse, wow, that's a great element in a model, in an approach to control that can be exported. So you can use it with the wall with Mexico, which is an Israeli wall, that's called the smart fence. You can use it in Iraq. You can use it all over the world. It's a model. And then, if you can frame it in the right way, if you can make the warehouse a good thing, like a prison. I mean, you could probably, you know, what society doesn't have a prison for the bad guys? You see, counterinsurgency is great. We should develop that because of the bad guys that we're attacking. They're the insurgents. They're the terrorists. So that the framing, and look how Israel has succeeded in that. When Israel imposed economic sanctions on Gaza, Israel and the United States, with Europe complicit, and Japan as well, John Dugard was the UN Special Rapporteur to the Palestinian territories for human rights. A very prominent South African judge who wrote that the imposing of sanctions on Gaza a couple of years ago was the first time in history that the oppressed were sanctioned. The oppressed were punished, and the oppressors, which is Israel, the occupying power, the oppressors, are scot-free. They're somehow the good guys, they're the victims, and the oppressed people are being punished by the United States. So it shows the power of framing. How you can take a situation of oppression and turn it on its head. So the oppressed people are the perpetrators that have to be punished because they're the terrorists, and all the language feeds into that, and the oppressor is the good guy. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's an element of warehousing, that there's this warehousing thing. If we look up from the occupation, I don't mean by this that we should minimize the struggle to free Palestine, that we should, begin to abstract the Palestinians. We should still keep that focus. But at the same time, and this is a part of the global Palestine that I'm trying to talk about, at the same time, we should be looking up and saying, why is there the support for the Israeli policy? Why is Israel succeeding so far in imposing this? And what are the implications for all of us? And I just want to say one word about that more. I know I'm going on too long, and then I'll stop. And that is that one of the questions we have to ask, and here I go back to strategy. If we're trying to become actors, if we're trying to mobilize people, one question we have to ask is, why should you care about this? We have to go to audiences. I mean, you care. But we could go to schools, we could go to, if we could ever find a general audience, if we could ever get to a movie theater and before the movie starts, talk to the people, the average people there, and say, why should you care about this? And I think one of our strategies should be, you've got to make this issue a local issue. People don't care about Palestinians. Palestinians are far away, and people don't care about issues because we're not trained to be critical thinkers. Issues aren't the center of the lives of most of us. What we care about is ourselves. All right, so why should this issue be of concern to you for selfish reasons? Because you're you. And I would say it should be of a concern because warehousing is being applied. It's not, the Palestinians are the guinea pigs. But guinea pigs are just guinea pigs. They're the first ones. That's what you're learning on. But it doesn't end with guinea pigs. The whole point of guinea pigs is that then you go on and you apply it to wider populations, right? So don't think that what's happening to the Palestinians is only going to happen to the Palestinians. Don't think that counterinsurgency is only going to stay with the bad guys. Don't think that counterinsurgency is only going to remain in the military realm and isn't going to get into your police forces. This is going to come home to roost. And I think that should be our message, that warehousing is a danger to everyone. I'm going to finish in a minute. I was in, she's been standing there for like 15 minutes. So I know I'm going on too long, but I sort of want to, I'll finish with this. I was in Edinburgh 3 weeks ago, and which is in Scotland for Americans that, you know. And when I was in Edinburgh, the Bank of Scotland disappeared. Oof, it's gone. The Bank of Scotland, which was the symbol of Scotland for them, that was established in the 17th century, was gone in one day. It was swallowed up by another bank, a British bank called Halifax. That was the next day swallowed up by another British bank that then went bankrupt. In one day, 40,000 people lost their jobs in Scotland. In one day. And these aren't the poor people. These are professional, educated, white, middle-class people. And they'll never be reintegrated. I mean, the system today is not going to reintegrate 40,000. Maybe a couple thousand here and there will find alternative employment. But the system doesn't need them. The system spits them out. It doesn't care. It spit out the poor from the beginning. But as it becomes more and more consolidated, as we can see, and the oligarchs begin to rule the world, the Buffetts and all these guys begin to rule the world, they don't need the middle class. So warehousing is then moving out from being a problem of poor people to being a problem that's going to, we're going to, or our kids could end up being warehoused. And again, what I want to say, just to emphasize, is that it's this issue of counterinsurgency that's really crucial. And this is an area that we can begin to develop wider cross-cutting issues with other groups in the peace community, in the progressive community that aren't with us today. This is an issue that can begin to unite groups, because this is a tremendous danger to civil liberties. You know, counterinsurgency is warfare against the people, but Israel every year has 2 conferences training for chiefs of major American police forces. And someone told me today that the Portland chief of police was in Israel for training not long ago, and it became an issue here. Israel works intimately with police forces. The United States has, because it's interesting, this whole military thing is not an issue in the left very much. The United States has budgeted today, the Pentagon has budgeted today $1.4 trillion for the development of new weapon systems over the next 20 years. Not the production, just the development. That stuff is counterinsurgents, a lot of it, it's high tech. And this is where the money is. Bill Gates is peanuts. It's high tech is military. And they're beginning to develop weaponry that we can't even imagine. I mean, most of us have trouble with our emails. You know, for example, Israel is the world's leader in nanotechnology, the military applications of nanotechnology. It's developing molecular scale weaponry, a lot of it that has to do with surveillance, which is another Israeli specialty coming out of the occupied territories, that laboratory. The mayor of Los Angeles and half the city council last month was in Israel, where signing contracts where Israeli firms are taking over the security and surveillance of LAX. You know, and Israel, and this is the framing. What's the framing? The framing is, you don't like to go to the airport. You're hassled. You got to take off your shoes, you got to take off your belt, you got to do this. Why? We'll make it easier. With nanotechnology, we'll insert one molecule It's not even a shot. One molecule into your body, that's a little sensor. It's a little sensor. So that, you set up the parameters in the airport of what's proper behavior, what's a normal person. And you can go in with this little molecule and you can walk through the airport, nobody looks at you, you go right to the duty-free, no checks, whatever. And if you happen to be a person that sets off an alarm for one of the parameters, and we know who those people are, and we're liable to be in that population, that sets off the alarm and they're taken aside. Nobody notices. It's polite. You've been randomly selected or whatever, and you're taken aside. So it's sold as something that's good, these sensors, this nanotechnology, because it frees you from having to be hassled, because you have to have security, right? Security is another part of the framing. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that this is a tremendous danger to civil liberties, that we have to think of ourselves, we have this saying, we're all Palestinians. That saying means that we're all Palestinians in the sense of solidarity with the oppressed, but we have to say we're all Palestinians from the point of view that we really are all Palestinians. That if they're the guinea pigs, we're the ones that they're experimenting on, that they're experimenting on the Palestinians in order to apply it to us. So I really think this idea of global Palestine, and connecting up to warehousing, and connecting it up to police forces and counterinsurgency and framing, this is an approach of globalizing the issue that can then bring in all kinds of other groups in the progressive movement. So we should be having meetings with people concerned with human rights, with civil liberties, with anti-war people. These are cross-cutting things. So that's what I want to suggest. The chilling scenario is that Israel will succeed in warehousing Palestinians, that they'll be permanently warehoused where there's no political process, it's static, they've disappeared, but that warehousing model will then be exported, and us or our children could become victims of it. So, all right, I'm sorry I went on so long, but I wanted to develop that idea.
You've been listening to the Executive Director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, Jeff Halper. The title of this lecture is From Apartheid to Warehousing, Israel's Strategies of Dispossession and Control. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from this presentation. Jeff Halper's most recent book is An Israeli in Palestine, Resisting Dispossession, Redeeming Israel, just out from Pluto Press. His other writings include Obstacles to Peace, a reframing of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, The Problem with Israel, and Counter-Rhetoric, co-authored with Emily Schaefer and Jimmy Johnson. To find out more about Jeff Halper and about the work of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, please visit the ICAD website at www.icad.org. Jeff Halper began the question and answer segment of his talk by describing the ways that people in the United States can support the work of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions.
Yes, we certainly need funding, especially because we just lost EU funding. We lost $370,000 a year because of a right-wing campaign in the EU to defund us. So we need that. If you want to write checks, you can write them to ICAD, ICAHD.org. ICAD USA, the American branch of ICAD. We have a PayPal button on our website. Our website is icad.org. And there's a PayPal, and it's secure and all that stuff. And there's a way to, if you want to make a contribution, but if you want to make, a monthly kind of arrangement, there's a way to do that as well. So I thank you for that. And now we have time for questions, comments, arguments, whatever, for a little while.
One member of the audience asked the speaker to explain how what is going on in Israel-Palestine varies from what the U.S. government pioneered with Native Americans.
Well, I mean, I guess it's you know, there's similarities in the concept of people that have been simply dismissed as a people, and warehousing. One of the differences, though, is that at least the Native Americans have American citizenship. I mean, they're warehoused in a sense, and they're poor, and even in cities they lived ghettoized, but nevertheless they have American citizenship. Whereas Palestinians, the warehousing of Palestinians will be in a way in which they have no Israeli citizenship. They'll have, in a way, they have citizenship in their warehouse. I mean, it's an interesting question as I think about it, because you know, the ironic outcome of the decolonialism could be that, okay, you have a state, you have your African countries, your Asian countries, your Latin American countries, but each country, or a lot of the countries, become warehouses. So your warehouse has a name, whatever the country is, and you have a citizenship, but in fact it's a citizenship in a warehouse rather than in an actual country. Naomi Klein writes about Sri Lanka in her book. You know, how for forever subsistence fishermen lived on the coasts, on the beaches, and that's where they lived, and that's where they would go out to fish. But according to the World Bank, subsistence fishermen are not part of the economy. They're not productive. They don't contribute to the GNP because they're considered the informal sector. They're not considered a part of the formal economy. So there was a lot of pressure to get them off and develop the beaches for tourism. And the World Bank, she writes all about this, the World Bank prepared a whole plan in which Sri Lanka becomes the vacation paradise for the elites all over the world. The idea being that there's a hotel beyond 5 stars. I mean, there's super luxury hotels, and that this would be really for the jet set that would jet into Sri Lanka, and it would be the global vacation paradise. But these fishermen were in the way, and what happened was you had the tsunami, and when the tsunami happened, all these fishermen that they could never get off the beaches because they had political support and they had their own clout, were moved to camps miles and miles inland. A law was passed immediately saying you cannot live on the beaches. And then hotels were given, all these hotel chains were given concessions on the beaches. So in a way, you can even be warehoused in your own country. So these fishermen are Sri Lankans, they're citizens and so on, but their country has been taken over by these elite interests and turned into a vacation paradise. So that you know, I mean, it's interesting to think about, but what is the relation, what really is freedom? You know, it's not simply, I mean, in human rights terms, it's self-determination. So you can say the Native Americans and the Sri Lankan fishermen might have freedom in the sense that they're citizens of their country, and there's no outward mechanism that keeps them in the warehouse. But because they're warehoused in all kinds of ways we know, they don't have self-determination, either personally or collectively. And so this warehousing idea, I think, is a very useful and powerful one, because it happens inside countries as well. It can be a whole country, it can happen inside countries, and then it can happen to particular populations. So, I haven't really thought it through, but I think there's some very useful things to think about in terms of the Native Americans. You had a question here and then.
The next audience member asked the speaker to talk about the tunnels in Gaza.
The tunnels? Yeah, I mean, there's something like 200 tunnels between Gaza and Egypt under the border. I mean, the fact, and this is, look at this, this is also a part of a prison break. I mean, if we think about prisons or warehouses, I mean, this is it. You know, the fact that 1.5 million people in the 21st century living by the Mediterranean, I mean, this isn't some jungle island in the South Pacific that no one's ever visited. I mean, this is in the center of Western civilization. 1.5 million people live by digging tunnels. And, you know, these tunnels, sick people go through the tunnels. You import. Cars are imported through the tunnels. Fuel is brought in. I mean, it's an actual border. It's like a port that's tunnels underground. There's more than 200 of them. The fact that people have to resort to that shows the degree to which warehousing takes place, but it also shows how resistance takes place. And this is really important. About the wall, for example, there's an architect that says, in architecture there's a principle that says there's no wall without a tunnel. I mean, they go together. People do not accept walls voluntarily. And they'll go over them, they'll go under them, they'll go through them if they can. I mean, and I think that's the lesson. I think, and let me say this, because it's really important. I didn't mean, and I don't want you to take away, I didn't mean to be fatalistic in any sense. I don't mean that warehousing is the future and that it's going to happen and that's it and no, I think we have to understand that this is a danger. We have to understand that it's a model that's being applied, that it's what different powers would like to have happen. But the Palestinians also teach us about resistance, that Israel is forced to go to this warehousing because of the resistance, but they're resisting the warehousing as well. That's what Gaza is all about, and that's what our votes going into Gaza was all about. We don't accept, and I think it generated waves all over the world, this action. So our work is also resistance, and we can defeat this. I mean, that's the whole point. If I didn't think we could win, that we could defeat all this stuff, I'd go home. I'd write my anthropology books like I'd like to do, and I wouldn't be running around to all you guys. I'm here because my job is to help identify the issues, identify the problems, to define the terms in order to empower us to resist. And if the Palestinians can resist warehousing in Gaza with an Israeli army and the Air Force assassinating them all the time, on top of them all the time, we can do the same thing. You know, they have much more freedom of action than the Palestinians do. So the tunnels might be our conception of the alternative and the resistance to the warehousing that takes place. Here and then over here.
The next audience member asked about the speaker's comment that Israel provides a model for counterinsurgency techniques. This audience member expressed the view that American Likudniks had been running the Defense Department and had modeled their strategy in Iraq on what they thought the Israeli government was doing in the occupied territories. This audience member observed that this strategy hasn't worked very well in Iraq and asked the speaker to comment on what he thought had gone wrong for the Americans in Iraq.
All right. Do you know Paul Wolfowitz was Netanyahu's campaign manager in 1996. So the connection is...
The second issue raised by this member of the audience was about the issue of warehousing surplus populations. The speaker had mentioned illegal immigrants in the United States. These workers actually do a lot of the grunt work in the United States, work that keeps the economy going. Palestinians who have work permits do a lot of the same kind of work in Israel to keep the Israeli economy going. These populations are not really marginal or surplus in terms of the role they play in keeping these economies functioning.
No, that's not really true. The concept of the apartheid system in South Africa was that the black Africans would be a cheap source of labor in South Africa. And that's, of course, the capitalist system is based on finding the cheapest labor and everything else. That was the case in Israel for quite a while, where the Palestinians were the cheap labor. Israel de-developed the occupied territories since 1967. It didn't allow banks to open, Palestinian banks. It destroyed the agriculture. I mean, Jim mentioned there's about 1.5 million olive and fruit trees that have been uprooted. That have nothing to do with security, obviously. The agriculture was largely destroyed. And the land was taken. And industry, in a very systematic way. And that threw the Palestinian labor force into the Israeli economy as casual laborers. You're right. They were cheap labor. They were exported. But what happened, ironically, at the beginning of the Oslo peace process, was that Israel discovered a cheaper form of labor. And that's foreign workers. So you have in Israel today 300,000 workers imported from China, Thailand, the Philippines, Romania, and West Africa. And they're cheaper than the Palestinians because you can pay them less than minimum wage. They get a visa. They don't get a visa personally. Their employer gets the visa for them through the manpower agencies. So you're indentured to your employer. You can't leave your employer. And if you quit, you're deported. So that you can pay them anything, you can abuse them, you can work them 14 hours a day, whatever. So that's a part of the warehousing as well. And that is that in a sense the Palestinian warehouse is worse than a Bantustan. Because South Africa depended on the black African labor. Israel does not need the Palestinian labor at all. And and from that point of view, that's where again the relief agencies come in, because the Palestinians today are kept alive by the Red Cross and all these relief agencies. They're not even working. They have no economy, and and that's I think the where the warehousing is that's in a sense the most extreme case is the best case if you're dealing with guinea pigs, because if you can solve the problem of how do you control 4 million people that have no economy, nothing, no resources, then to apply it to conditions that are maybe a little bit better in other countries, I think is much easier. I think that's the situation, of the Palestinians in that sense. You in the back, and then.
The next member of the audience had 2 questions for the speaker. The first question was about the efforts to influence mainstream politicians, elected officials in Washington. Does the speaker have any suggestions for the kind of arguments that might be effective with such an audience? Arguments that might influence mainstream politicians here in the United States. The second question was about Jewish groups that work on these issues. Do you think that Jewish groups, as Jewish groups, have any particular role to play here in the United States in terms of efforts to change U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine?
Look, that's a really good direction. I go back, and this is a key part of our strategy. I go back to this idea of framing, because Israel has succeeded in framing the conflict, in a way that supports its interests. In other words, it's framed in that, like I said, there's no occupation. You'll never ever hear a pro-Israeli person use the word occupation. You're talking about Judea and Samaria and the land of Israel and the Jews as victims. So the Jews as victims is a key part of it in the framing. Israel as a democracy and terrorism. I mean, those are some of the main elements. So if that's the framing and you're a liberal Democrat, you're a liberal Jew. I mean, the Jews are very much for human rights. That defines Jews in this country. You're able to identify with that because what Israel succeeded in doing is to capture the buzz phrases, to hook into you. It's taken your fears, it's taken your values, democracy on one side, security on the other side, and it's framed it in a way that Israel is exactly it's an ally in the war against terror, and it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's very American. The most brilliant piece of PR in history, in my view, is the book Exodus by Leon Uris. I mean, we know, those of us my age at least, there was nobody in my generation that didn't read Exodus when they were in high school. It was translated into 100 languages. But in the States, you know, it was this cowboy story with this blonde Aryeh Ben Canaan, a Holocaust survivor, and his beautiful girlfriend Karen, who's raped and murdered by Arabs, and then it became a movie with Paul Newman. I mean, you know, music by Henry Mancini, sung by Andy Williams. I mean, you know, how much more American can Israel become? You see? And it was a beautiful framing in that sense. And that's fashioned Israel's image ever since. I think the fact that without doing it systematically, over the years we've managed to reframe, to get people to really get away from, that was internalized. Framing is tremendously powerful because it's internalized and it becomes a part of you. So when I go to the Jewish community, look, I think I don't get into the Jewish community. I'll never, actually when I was here last time I spoke at a synagogue, but the rabbi didn't show up. I mean, it was a venue. It was a venue like here, but it wasn't really speaking to the Jewish community. Neve Shalom, was it? Will? Yeah. Neve Shalom. So once in a while, the other day I gave a Yom Kippur sermon to Michael Lerner's group in San Francisco, the Spiritual Progressives, which I think is a contradiction in terms, but never mind. But what I'm saying is, if I don't get to talk to the Jewish community, it's not because, to tell you the truth, they don't agree with me. I don't think that's necessary. It's that they've internalized this image of Israel, the Leon Uris, Golda Meir, Exodus image. And that's the linchpin of their identity as Jews. And what else do they have besides Israel? You see? And I'm coming. It's not like the analysis. I think most Jews, if they sit down and they disconnect, would agree. I mean, I bet you 90% of the Jews would agree. The problem is that Israel's not the issue. The issue is I need this idealized image of Israel for my Jewish identity. If I lose that, I'm a white middle class person. What makes me Jewish? What keeps my kids Jewish? I mean, I don't go to synagogue much. I'm not religious. It's Israel. Israel, this idealized image, is what mobilizes people. American Jews raised $350 million in the wake of the Lebanon war a couple years ago to rebuild the Galilee. Just that effort of raising $350 million means organizing, getting the kids out, propaganda. That's what keeps the community alive. If they lose Israel, it's like they're gone. So they're holding with their fingernails onto this idealized image. Here I come, and I present a different Israel. It's not that they don't agree, but if I crack that image, if I help destroy that idealized image, the center of their lives is gone. It's true. Every rabbi will tell you, if you ask them, when they have Israel. Okay, when you have a program about Israel, you bring in an Israeli speaker to talk about music in Israel or ethnic tensions in Israel or something. Nobody comes. American Jews are not interested in Israel. They don't go to Israel. They don't care about Israel, especially the young people. But so then how do you explain this tremendous emotionalism around Israel? Because, again, it's this need to protect and preserve this image. That's framing. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to reframe for American Jews. That's the key. When you go to a liberal audience or to a liberal Democratic member of Congress, you've got to present a reframing. Because a framing is internalized, it's very threatening to me if you're calling that into question, because it's not just changing the opinion. It means my worldview, my, what's good, what's bad, everything, so I can get you intellectually, and I can bring you to a point where you can say, okay, I see your point, but if I don't help you make a transition to another alternative framing, you're not going to go there. You're going to retreat back into the paradigm that you know. So we have to take people by the hand and reframe and help them to get to another place, that isn't threatening, but that frees them then to think about things differently. For example, we have a Jewish reframing. When I speak to a Jewish audience, I don't start with the occupation and this stuff. I mean, they'd turn everybody off. They'd walk out in a minute. I start with human rights, because that really resonates with Jews. I even start with a very cute thing. I say there's a hero in the Jewish world that you've never heard of. No Jew in the United States has ever heard of this guy, who is really probably the major figure in the Jewish world in the 20th century, and that's René Cassin. René Cassin was the author, a French Jew who was the author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was the Thomas Jefferson of the world of human rights. Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1968, and he's buried, if you know Paris, one good thing you have to say about the French is they built a temple called the Pantheon for intellectuals. It's where all the Victor Hugo and the major intellectuals of the French Republic are buried. And he's buried, René Cassin is buried there. A tremendously important figure that no one's ever... Well, Jews like that. Wow, we've got this Thomas Jefferson of the world, and it's human rights and social justice. And then you've hooked them. You see, you've got into their framing, into their values, and then I backed them into Israel and the occupation. You see, and all of a sudden they see this alternative logic, and I have a Christian reframing. That talks about, I deal with Christian values and Christian language, and then we go on from there. And this is what you have to do. You have to develop an American reframing. That's in a sense what I was starting with. I was saying, this is a danger to civil liberties. That's something Americans resonate with. I didn't start with, let's be in solidarity with the oppressed Palestinians, because you're the people that speaks to. That's it. But a danger to civil liberties, now you're starting to use an American language, and you get into democracy versus ethnocracy and all this stuff, and once you hook people, you can pull them in. So you have to find what is the language and you know what, I'm not the one I've been working on this for a long time. But there is, many of you know George Lakoff. So George Lakoff is a cognitive brain specialist or whatever who's written about reframing. He has this new book now, but one of his books is Don't Think of an Elephant. And he's worked a lot with the Democratic Party. And he's really saying that the Republicans have succeeded in framing things, family values. So what that does is you get unemployed people in Ohio, which is the most depressed state probably in the Union, with the largest, and they vote Republican because what he says is people vote their values. They vote their emotions. They don't vote their interests, actually. And so they vote family values rather than, the fact that they're unemployed. So the Republicans have picked up on that and are very good at framing things in that emotional way that brings people in. Democrats haven't done, and we all resist it. I resist it too. I resist the idea that's very dear to me, that people aren't so rational, that I can't sit down with you and present, why do I have to play these games? I can't sit down with you and present a problem and you say, geez, okay, no, because it's so embedded in the emotionalism and in the world values and the framing and all that stuff. So that's what we have to try to do. Is to find a way to get through that, and we have to have a liberal democratic framing. We have to have an American framing. I have a woman's framing. For example, the women's experience in house demolitions or in occupation is very different from that of men. So if I can begin to express women's, how women relate to it, that relates very much especially to women's audiences and beyond. So that's, I think, part of the answer to what you're saying. Here, and then I'll go over here.
The next question from the audience referred to the speaker's comparison between the wall being built along the U.S. border with Mexico and the separation wall being built by Israel to define the boundaries of a Palestinian Bantustan. This member of the audience asked the speaker to discuss the position of immigrants in the United States, and in particular within the context of the theme of warehousing surplus populations.
Okay, now it's getting late, so you guys tell me when you want to go, and I'll let one more person ask the question. I don't want to keep you here all night. All right, that'll be the person. But or maybe we're at that point now. But I don't want to keep us here. So we'll have maybe one more question after this, and then I'll let you go. I mean, the whole issue of the wall is very interesting. And the wall that's being built, like I said, is an Israeli wall, and it's done. But it's a smart fence. It's not a wall in the sense of a wall. It's sensors, and it's Elbit Systems that's really building it. That's the Israeli company, the most specialized in sensors and lenses. Elbit is involved with this nanotechnology. They've developed lenses that are molecular in size almost. I mean, tiny, tiny. Israel, for example, is developing what it calls a bionic hornet, which is a miniature, little almost invisible machine, flying machine, that can be equipped with these cameras and can be sent into your bedrooms. It's called swarming. Swarming is a major concept of counterinsurgency. And you can swarm, and you send them into bedrooms in Nablus. But I'm telling you, the Portland Police Force is going to be interested in that in an hour, and that'll start coming in. So that the fence with Mexico is a very interesting experiment in exactly what we're talking about. How do you create a fence that seems friendly or smart? It's a smart fence. Because the Americans don't want a wall, a Berlin Wall that keeps out Mexicans. So you can use these very sophisticated high-tech systems to de facto create a wall that's impregnable. You can't, anytime you pass a certain point, the sensors pick it up and you're caught, but you don't see it. You don't feel it, And you can go through the border as free as you ever did, and in other words, it's this thing that if you're a normal person, normal meaning, you're a part of the non-critical masses, it doesn't affect you. You don't see it. It doesn't. You're not limited by it. You're not inhibited by it. You just walk around. And if you happen to be one of those target groups that we want to keep out, or surveillors, keep surveillance on, then you're picked out and you're targeted. So that's, I think, the implication of this. The fence with Mexico would really be a very good thing to research and to bring out, because it's a very interesting application of this Israeli seemingly, and the framing, friendly fence, smart fence, protecting our security and so on. And I think that would be a really good example. People don't know the details of the fence, of the wall, even the word. Is it a fence? Israel, for example, refuses to let you use the word wall for the 26-foot concrete walls. It's a fence, you see. And if I can say fence, it sounds better. I mean, it's the same complex I've talked about. I mean, that's part of the reframing. If you can take one particular thing like that and deconstruct it, and show people how it works, then people begin to get the point. You'd have a lecture and show how that fence works and where it comes from and everything. That would be an amazing, eye-opening thing, I think, for people that don't really know. Last but certainly not least.
The next member of the audience referred back to the speaker's discussion of how Israel has become such an important part of Jewish identity in the United States. In contrast to the Jewish American framework, this member of the audience asked the speaker to talk about the Israeli framing of the conflict. The speaker had talked about the radical reconceptualization that South Africans had to go through, but it seems that such a reconceptualization would be far more difficult for Israelis, Jewish Israelis, because of the religious significance of the land, because of this sense of exclusive entitlement to the land. How do you imagine such a reconceptualization would take place? What would it look like? How can you change and reconceptualize the State of Israel?
Well, I write about that in my book. Because you have, the Zionism that we talk about, we just talk about Zionism, means political Zionism. This is a Zionism that was developed by Ben-Gurion and the people that took power. They were power people that wanted a state and all that stuff. But there's another Zionism that was parallel to that, that was much more intellectual, and that's why it never succeeded. That's called cultural Zionism. And this was, for example, Martin Buber was a part of cultural, or what's her name? Henrietta Zold, who founded the Hadassah, women's Jewish organization, was a part of that. And that was basically saying, Jews are a nation. It accepted the nationalist kind of a framing, and we want to revive our national culture in our homeland, which is Israel. And we want a university, and we want Hebrew literature, and revive the Hebrew language and our national, all that stuff. But you don't need a state to do that. On the contrary, the cultural Zionists were against states, because a lot of them came out of Russia. And the Russian model of a state wasn't exactly what they wanted to replicate in Palestine or in their own country, in the future Jewish. So they were thinking about cultural Zionism. Ahat Ha'am was one of the major Zionist figures. There's streets named after him, who was a cultural Zionist. So they were imagining a situation in which you could get into an accommodation with the Palestinian Arabs. They were imagining a binational kind of a thing, where in fact the state was kind of neutral. And they understood that the Palestinian Arabs wanted their own national renaissance and their self-determination and so on, and the Jews did as well. And the only way to do it together was that each group have its cultural right to have its culture, but that the state, if there was a state, because it wasn't, this is under the British Mandate period, the whole political part was left very vague. That was part of the problem. The political Zionists really developed what the Jewish state would be. The cultural Zionists kind of stayed on the more philosophical level. But I think cultural Zionism has, in a way, it's come back to being more relevant, because political Zionism has exhausted itself. I don't believe, I live in Israel for all kinds of reasons, and I'm there, but I don't believe that Israel is sustainable as a Jewish state. It just can't be. You can't have a state. Today, forget the occupied territories. 30% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish. A lot of Israelis, a lot of Israelis are, you talked about how many Israelis want to leave. Israelis can leave. You've got probably, it's not reflected in the figures, you have probably 1 million out of 5 million Israeli Jews that don't live in Israel, that have permanently emigrated. I'm sure you have a bunch in Portland. So that I don't think it's sustainable. And it's true, part of our framing has to be to present an alternative vision. And the words we use is, we talk about an Israel of all its citizens. In other words, we're trying to use the democratic imagery and concepts, because that does speak to Israelis do think they live in a democracy, and they want that and so on, to try to say, look, we have to really rethink, especially if the two-state solution is gone. One of the alternatives that I write about, which is way too early to advocate, because I'm not sure if a one-state solution is the answer either. Because the history of binational states is not a happy history. So I'm not so sure if that's a great model. So I'm looking at what I call a Middle East confederation. An economic confederation, something like the EU was before it was a U. When it was still a more looser economic confederation. And I'm seeing something that could be Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And the trick is that like in Europe, everybody would have the right to live and work throughout the region, which would neutralize. You see, the whole question. I'm not going to get into this now, and it's good. It's the last question. The whole problem of how big can the Palestinian state be? Settlements, borders, water, all that stuff is only important if the Palestinian state is a standalone entity. Because if it's a Palestinian state and you have to deal with the refugees coming back, there's an amazing fact. You know, more than 60% of Palestinians are under the age of 18. So if you get a state, but you don't have an economy for these kids, for the future, then what good is it? So the question of viability is really crucial here. And if you're thinking about a Middle Eastern confederation in which Palestinians have their state, however big it is, they have a parliament, they're in the international community, but they're not confined to it. In fact, they can be citizens and they can work throughout the region, including Israel, from Israel to Syria. Then the issue of where the border is you've neutralized that problem, in a sense. So we are trying to think of political alternatives that go together with the framing, so we can again offer people. So I think a combination of cultural Zionism with the idea of a Middle East confederation begins to redraw things in a way that isn't threatening to Israelis, but on the contrary, even kind of goes along with what they like. I'll end on the essential element of Zionism. It's even quintessentially Zionist. Because the whole idea of Zionism actually was that we are a Middle Eastern people, that we're coming home. This is a return. The Middle East is the hearth of our civilization. You know, there's more of Jewish history in Iraq than there is in Palestine, the land of Israel. Iraq is where the Talmud was formulated and where the whole, where Abraham came from. I mean, so that if you can present an image in which we're really coming home and we're really becoming more a part of the Middle East and all that stuff, then this, again, you're reframing it in a way where you're taking Zionism and using it for more constructive purposes. So thank you much.
You've been listening to Executive Director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, Jeff Halper, speaking in Portland, Oregon, on October 11, 2008. The title of this lecture is From Apartheid to Warehousing, Israel's Strategies of Dispossession and Control. To find out more about Jeff Halper and about the work of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, please visit the ICAD website at www.icahd.org. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. Special thanks to the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Portland for their support for Jeff Halper's visit to Portland and for providing the venue for this presentation. To find out more about pdxjustice Media Productions and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find presentations by Barbara Ehrenreich, Noam Chomsky, Paul Krugman, Susan Faludi, Amira Haas, and many, many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Slave trade that was extremely profitable, and really involved whole industries and, was declared illegal finally by the British government, that began to enforce it even among ships of other countries. That was a civil society success. That was churches organizing. I don't know if you saw, there's a film, Wilberforce, the whole hymn Amazing Grace came, I think it was called Amazing Grace, came out of that period. But, that was civil society. It was the Quakers were very involved in that. The Quakers, it's even funny, the Quakers, I used to run a Quaker college called Friends World College. The Quakers always said, it took us 200 years through a consensus process to get to an anti-slavery place. Once we did, we really started to work seriously. But, it was the Quakers, it was churches, it was other progressive elements, and it happened. And if we think back in terms of anti-war struggles, the suffragette movement, women's issues, if we think about the anti-colonial struggles, anti-war struggles, today you have environmental. We're all over the place, which is good. We could be more organized. And we're dealing with all kinds of issues as critical people. And really, if you look at the history of the world, it would be a pretty miserable place today if it hadn't been for us. In all kinds. So I think a museum like that, or a site like that, would kind of let us know that there's a context, that we're not alone, we're not so isolated, and would give us a little bit more, maybe a little bit more encouragement to work. But that's, in a sense, where I'm coming from. I think that we can influence policy. We work with, in ICAD, we work with diplomats, and actually, it's not just civil society, but governments. I've discovered that governments are interested in what we have to say. Not always the Prime Minister and the President and those guys that are all politically motivated, but the professional people and many people in parliaments, less so in Congress, but there's a few. There are people that are with us that we can work with, that like our voice, that are really like our analysis. I want to tell you that by thousands of communities and cities around the world, there's a lot of people. You saw that, last time, most dramatically in all the demonstrations around the world against the invasion of Iraq. And then people kind of got despondent that we didn't stop the invasion of Iraq, and they went back into the woodwork. But you don't always win. But at the same time, we in civil society have quite a few successes under our belts. One of the things I want to do, I'm just telling you, if anybody has an extra $1 million, I'll tell you where I'd like to go after this, or in addition to this, I would love to set up a kind of a museum of civil society. I think we're missing that, at least, if not a physical museum, at least a virtual museum on the internet. They have these sites where you can go in and visit the Louvre, the museum, and you go in. They have the virtual Louvre, I think, on the internet. You go into different rooms and you can see the Renaissance paintings and different periods, and then you get a description of the paintings, and you can look. You really can get a tour. And I'd like to have at least something like that, where you could have a kind of a historical tour of civil society, and have it in a way that people, everywhere you go, here in Portland, you have your local heroes. You have people that in the 30s or whatever organized strikes against, for workers' rights in certain areas. You have women here that played key roles in communities, different. You have a rich civil society history here in Portland, and maybe some of you know those Portland heroes, but they're not known in Seattle or in Jerusalem or wherever. And I'd like to have a kind of a site where people all over the world plug in their local heroes with pictures and with stories. And you could develop a huge museum like that. And the reason is to show us that we're not so isolated, and we're not so marginal, and we're not so little, actually, and that we've had successes. Last year was the 200th anniversary of the legal end of the transatlantic slave trade. You know, 1807, you know, the All right, it's very good to be here among friends. There were so many sponsors. I think there's as many sponsors as there are people in the audience. So each of you must represent another organization. You know, I've spoken for so many years on this, and I would assume that most of you are the choir. That I don't want to, I don't want to keep going over Occupation 101 each time. So what I'd like to do is sort of take the discussion a step further. I'll touch a little bit on the situation for those, you know, that maybe are a few people that are new. But basically, I look at you, I might be wrong, but I look at you as people that are informed about the issue, that are concerned about the issue, that know the basics of the issue. And what I'm concerned about is that we go another step and go from being informed about what's going on to really developing strategies of how do we end the occupation, how do we bring about a just peace. Thanks. And okay, good. Thanks. And also, you know, to strategize in terms of changing policy. You know. ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, that I head, you know, in some ways, I think we're a little bit unique among Israeli peace organizations. And I don't know about here in the States. I mean, you know, you can make the associations, but often I feel that a lot of the groups that we're a part of, we have our little meetings in churches and so on, but we sometimes don't expect that we're really going to influence policy. That, you know, we're not elected, we don't have power, we don't have masses behind us, we think. And I think that certainly in Israel, that's the feeling among a lot of the activist groups. I mean, there are quite a few activist groups, but they all tend to be activist. In other words, the Israeli peace movement is comprised of, it's like a collection of activists. So we're out, I mean, we do a lot of stuff. You know, we're out planting olive trees, and then the next week we're building a house, and the next week we're bringing water down to the Bedouins, and the next week we're protesting the wall. There's a lot of stuff going on, but there's no program, there's no strategy, and I think part of it comes from the fact, and actually people have told me this. They said, look, we can't influence policy. You know, why should we fool ourselves? You know, what we can do is protest. You know, we can maybe raise issues to a certain degree. We can be in solidarity with each other, but that's about it. And that I don't accept. And that's where ICAD, I think, has tried to show, we think that we can be an actor in this whole thing, in world affairs, that we can, not we individually, but we as an organization with other organizations and with civil society, we can influence policy. And what's heartening for me is, as I travel all over the world, you know, I'm meeting groups like this all over. I mean, in little towns, you know, in places you wouldn't expect. So that what's called, we used to be called the people in the 60s. We called ourselves the people. Today there's even a fancier term. We've graduated. We're now known as the International Civil Society. You know, which has almost become a buzzword. You have civil society conferences and civil society this and that. But someone once called civil society the world's second superpower. Because in fact, we have a lot more clout than we're aware of. Because if you multiply this, I mean, look how many people we are. I mean, we're a very small part of the population. I don't know in any society how many people are really critical. To become critical and aware isn't easy in any society. You're not taught to be that way often by your parents. If you're lucky to be born in the right family, maybe you have a head start. The school system certainly doesn't prepare you for being critical. If you're a critical thinker, you flunk. I mean, not that I'm so bright, but I was a terrible student in high school and college. So my mother says I'm speaking in all the universities I could never have gotten into. And you don't get critical analysis from the media. And churches, I mean, there are some good churches, but overall the churches are a part of the establishment and the synagogues. And in other words, if you're a person that's bright and interested, it isn't easy to really become critical. It's almost by chance. You happen to have a teacher. You happen to know somebody who I was talking today to someone who went to Israel and happened to get to know somebody that took her to Ramallah. And all of a sudden a whole new world opens, but it's serendipitous. Or maybe you hear a speaker somewhere, or you marry somebody that all of a sudden has a whole side you didn't suspect. In other words, for people to become critical in most societies, it's a serendipitous thing. It isn't something that's easy to do. And that's one reason why, I think we're so few. I think this really represents a conscious policy on the parts of states. Governments run school systems, and they run the system. I think it's actually, I wouldn't say a conspiracy, but certainly what governments want is for people to come out of the school system as good citizens and people that'll fit into the workplace. And critical people are very hard to herd. And therefore we tend to be small in numbers, and therefore I think sometimes we feel that we're marginal, that we're powerless, that we're kind of a voice in the wilderness, and so